In the aftermath of the strikes by the U.S. and Iran, both countries are claiming their actions were justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Under that charter, countries are required to immediately report to the 15-member Security Council any measures taken in exercising the right of self-defense.
According to Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Tehran has no plans to step up confrontations with the United States, but calling the missile attack on military bases Tuesday a, quote, measured, proportionate response, while U.S. Ambassador Kelly Craft has called the U.S. airstrikes a response to an escalating series of armed attacks. Here to weigh in on those justifications is Barbara Slavin. She's the director of the Future of Iran Initiative for the Atlantic Council. Barbara, it's great to see you.
Great to have you, Barbara.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Barbara, what do you make of both of these justifications under the United Nations Charter and under an international? How has the international community viewed these actions? What do you think?
Well, I think the international community has viewed this entire crisis with great alarm. This entire escalatory spiral, which really began when the United States announced last May that it was going to try to prevent Iran from exporting any oil. This is a year after the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. And of course, since then, we have seen more and more incidents in the Persian Gulf, the American drone, the tankers, the attack on the Saudi oil facilities, leading up to where we were just before New Year's and the latest events. So it's been very, very troubling, and I think most people in the international community simply want this crisis to end, but I frankly don't see how it's going to end.
Yeah.
And what do you make of the belated, I would say, congressional potential action on voting on a war powers resolution and trying to constrain this president moving forward?
Good luck to them.
Yeah.
This is a president who seems to think that a tweet is adequate notification of military action. But I do think the president perhaps looked into the abyss the other day and decided after the reaction to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani that perhaps it would be good to pause U.S. action for a little while.
And so, Barbara, do you see any capability for the United Nations in order to even get involved here? One of the interesting things you were talking about yesterday was that 20 years ago, the UN Secretary General would have been a pivotal figure in something like this, shuttle diplomacy and all that. I mean, frankly, they've been completely missing from this entire discussion. Is that an intention? Is that just a function of the institution? What do you think?
Well, I think that this administration, Trump administration, certainly has not paid very much attention to the UN. When it walked out of the Iran nuclear deal, it was violating a UN Security Council resolution. It's threatened to withhold funds. I think it has withheld funds from the UN. And no offense to Ms. Craft, but she's not exactly a professional diplomat. It used to be that you sent very experienced diplomats, people who had long service in the field, to the United Nations. Another factor, the U.S. just refused a visa for the foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif. If they were really interested in diplomacy and some sort of off-ramp, that's the last thing they would have done.
The president suggested yesterday that they would impose additional economic sanctions on Iran. I mean, what more can they do? And, will that increase the pressure, or have they basically maxed out what they can do in terms of sanctions?
I can't imagine what's left to sanction. No, this entire policy of maximum pressure has been a maximum failure. Countries do not compromise. They do not negotiate when their backs are to the wall, especially if you look at authoritarian states. I mean, places like Cuba or North Korea or Venezuela, the more pressure you put on them, the more obstinate they become. So I think that this whole policy has primarily been done for domestic political reasons, and I don't think that Donald Trump has shown, or his administration has shown, a real understanding of the consequences.
Now, Barbara, the counter that I've heard is that, okay, well, President Reagan wiped out half the Iranian Navy. There was quite a bit of pressure that was put on them, and then the Iranians backed down. Or, that the Iranians have shown that through the Iran-Iraq war, that after immense pressure, blood, treasure, except that is lost, that they are very willing to take a compromise, not even a compromise, a straight-up, basically admission of détente between the two nations. What's your response to that?
Well, I just don't think there's a comparison. The 8-year war decimated the Iranian economy. It killed or wounded 1 million people. So we're nowhere close to that kind of situation. Also, the Iranians, the war ended where it began. Iran did not lose any territory. It continued to insist on a UN resolution that would blame Saddam Hussein for starting that war, and eventually the UN did belatedly pass such a resolution. So accepting a ceasefire was not capitulation. What the Trump administration has demanded of Iran is capitulation. It has told Iran that it can have no uranium enrichment program, no ballistic missiles. It has to remove its forces from everywhere they're involved in the Middle East, stop supporting all these various partners and proxies that it spent decades building up. It's a completely unrealistic set of demands. The other problem, of course, is the incoherence in the administration policy. What is the goal of maximum pressure? Is it a New Deal? Is it that Iran never have nuclear weapons? Is it a photo op with the president between our presidents? Or is it regime change? And members of the Trump administration have cheered on demonstrators in Iran. They've suggested that the goal is regime change from time to time, which means that Iran is definitely not going to talk to this administration unless this administration changes its views.
Speak, if you could, to the domestic political situation within Iran. The public was basically really calling for a strong response. There seemed to be some indications that state media tried to play this up, even trying to claim that some Americans were killed in these airstrikes on our two bases in Iraq. Is this response going to be sufficient to satisfy the public, or do you think that more could be coming?
I think the public simply doesn't want another war. So yes, I think this is fine with them, and they will accept whatever way in which the government tries to portray it, saying that Americans were killed when Americans weren't killed. Iranians are exhausted, and they have lost hope in a better future. That's been one of the results of the Trump administration quitting the Iran nuclear deal. The other thing is that there were demonstrations against their own government, very robust ones, late last year, and those are now going to be completely suppressed because there's been a rally around the flag after the assassination of Soleimani, who was a popular figure in Iran. He did his killing outside the country, not inside the country,
right.
And he fought against ISIS primarily. So people will not dare to come out in the streets and protest. So we've set back the cause of democracy in Iran, I think, indefinitely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. Great to have your perspective.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Next on Rising, Senator Mike Lee described yesterday's congressional briefing on Iran as, quote, probably the worst briefing, at least on a military issue, I've ever seen.
That is just one example of the anger expressed on Capitol Hill about the Trump administration's military actions against Iran. Congressman Ruben Gallego is going to talk to us about today's House vote to limit the president's war powers. That's next.